Founders Day at Tuskegee University provides us an opportunity to remember the varied legacies that have shaped this place, the people, and the actions that have been taken and left for us in terms of buildings, history, culture, and the community that we serve. And on this occasion, I have the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Paul Devlin, who is an accomplished critic, journalist, and academician. He has also distinguished himself as a leading scholar of the work of our famed alumnus, Albert Murray, whose writings as an American literary and jazz critic, novelist, essayist, and biographer presents an authentic analysis of African American life as he unapologetically knew it and lived it. As you might imagine, Dr. Devlin has been an invited guest speaker at other well-known academic institutions such as Harvard, Columbia, University of Virginia, and the University of Alabama. I might also add that Dr. Devlin is not a stranger to Tuskegee University. I understand that while he was in Alabama giving a series of talks on the life and work of Albert Murray, he also visited Tuskegee University in 2010 and 2013. In addition to his scholarly writings about Mr. Murray, Dr. Devlin has been very involved with Murray's legacy in other ways as well. He was the consultant for an exhibition on Murray's book, South to a Very Old Place, that opened at the American Writers Museum in Chicago, and he wrote the introduction to the 40th anniversary edition of Murray's Stomping the Blues, which is a wonderful nonfiction book that fosters a greater appreciation for blues and jazz as musical information for African American life and art. Currently, Dr. Devlin is employed as an assistant professor of English at the United States Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point, New York. The biography in your program recounts Dr. Devlin's extensive career, and I won't go into that deeper because the information you have before you. Indeed, I will just add that I am certain that given his combined talents as author, scholar, and speaker, he will find a masterful way to connect Tuskegee's alumnus Albert Murray with the legacy of our founder, Dr. Booker T. Washington, who said, "Few things can help an individual more than to place responsibility on him and to let him know that you trust him." So without further ado, I invite the audience to join me in welcoming Dr. Devlin to the podium. Dr. Devlin.
Good morning, Tuskegee University community. Undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty and staff, alumni, members of the board, Interim President Morris, Michelle Murray, daughter of Albert and Moselle Murray, and Louis P. Jones, trustee of the Albert Murray Trust. I would also like to thank my Aunt Maureen, who came down from New York, my mom, Rosemary Devlin, came down from New York, and my sister, Tara Devlin, came in from California. I stand before you today as a beneficiary of Dr. Booker T. Washington's dedication to education. I did not attend Tuskegee, but in my third year of college at St. John's University in New York, I became an acolyte and protege of Tuskegee's most distinguished graduate in the field of literature, Albert Murray, class of 1939, author, thinker, genius, and a kind and wise and generous mentor to me and to so many others. Mr. Murray found the time to help guide my quest for knowledge when he was 84 and had the schedule of a man half his age. Because of his commitment to education developed at Tuskegee. This morning I will tell you about Mr. Murray's work, about the ways Dr. Washington appears in his work, and about Mr. Murray's experiences as a student and a professor here. It is astounding to me that I should be standing before you today, 17 years later, delivering this address on this 101st Founders Day. I am well aware of the magnitude of this day on which, in addition to honoring Dr. Washington, whom I will discuss at length, we honor Mr. Murray, who passed away in 2013 at age 97, and we honor his wife, Moselle Menifee Murray, class of 1943, who passed away in 2015 at age 95. They were married for 72 years until Mr. Murray's death. They met here and were married here. This morning, their ashes will be interred in the university cemetery. Mr. Murray's books have recently been republished in a 2-volume definitive edition by Library of America, co-edited by Henry Louis Gates, Jr. and me. Inclusion in Library of America's prestigious series means that a writer's work will be available in perpetuity and never fall out of print. Mr. Murray has thus taken his place among the giants of American letters. I have had the honor of being the scholarly editor of 2 other Murray books as well. Murray wrote 13 books, including The Omni-Americans, Some Alternatives to the Folklore of White Supremacy, a collection of essays on American culture that influenced a generation of writers and thinkers. His second book, South to a Very Old Place, a memoir of and reflection on the South, is widely considered to be his literary masterpiece. It contains a long chapter about his undergraduate days at Tuskegee. Next came The Hero in the Blues, a critical study of the relationship between the literary protagonist and the blues tradition. And then Train Whistle Guitar, a rollicking novel of growing up in Mobile in the 1920s. His next book, Stomping the Blues, is an influential history and poetics of jazz and the blues. It was republished last year with a new introduction by me. I won't mention all the others, but I must note Good Morning Blues, the autobiography of Count Basie, as told to Albert Murray, which Basie recruited Murray to write. Out of the research for that book, namely Murray's interviews with Basie's longtime drummer Joe Jones, grew what became Riptide, the life and opinions of Papa Joe Jones, which Murray entrusted me to put together, and which was published in 2011. This is the 3rd time I have spoken at Tuskegee, and it is my 4th visit to the campus. Each time I come here, I feel a sense of reverence from having read so much about it and from having listened to Mr. Murray speak about it on so many occasions. Mr. Murray received an honorary doctorate here on Founders Day in 1999. Presidents of the United States, philanthropists, politicians, and distinguished educators have stood on this rostrum on this day. I am aware of the historical magnitude of this day, and I am humbled to be a part of its history. Today is a day of great personal significance for me and for many here. It is also a day of institutional, local, regional, national, and global significance, for today we inter the ashes of one of the most important writers of the 20th century. It is thus a significant day in literary history as well as an important day for Tuskegee's legacy. Murray's name will forever be remembered alongside Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, William L. Dawson, Monroe N. Work, and so many others. But let us shift the scene a few degrees of latitude northward for a moment to a fictionalization of one of the most legendary re-encounters in American literary history. In Murray's final novel, The Magic Keys, the protagonist, named Scooter, is walking north on 5th Avenue in Manhattan, somewhere between 42nd and 47th Streets. He spots a former classmate walking ahead of him on the avenue. They went to a college much like Tuskegee. Scooter calls out, "Hey, let that bucket down right there where you at, old partner. You know what the man said." If I wore glasses, I would adjust them to the end of my nose right now to tell you that while he is one of the most educated protagonists in American literature, he nevertheless plays idiomatic and vernacular variations on the verb to be. The protagonist's double-voice paraphrase of Washington is recognized immediately by its intended recipient, a character inspired by Ralph Ellison. Quote, "And as if we were rehearsing the sequence in a theater piece, he turned and looked at me, not in recognition, but as if more amused than surprised, and said, 'What say, man?' This is a fictionalized rendering of Murray's reconnection with Ralph Ellison in 1942. The book critic John Leonard called it the creation myth of the post-war black intelligentsia. And as Murray crafted this creation myth, if it is that, As Murray crafted this creation myth, if it is that, he is of course playing a riff here on one of the most famous moments in American oratory, from Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition Address of 1895, in which he implored Americans to cast down your buckets where you are. Washington told the story of a ship on which people were dying of thirst. They thought they were on salt water, but didn't realize they were in the mouth of the Amazon River. They signaled another ship, informed the other ship that they were dying of thirst, and the other ship signaled back, cast down your buckets where you are. That is, on top of a source of fresh water. Washington's statement about befriending one's neighbors, a statement often misunderstood, came at one of the darkest moments in African American history, spoken 1 year prior to the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, after 18 years of deteriorating conditions for African Americans following the betrayal of Reconstruction in 1877. Washington's statement was a gambit. Washington's statement was an attempt to forestall or arrest the formation of a toxic white supremacist ideology. Washington's metaphor is rhizomatic. It is about establishing connections in a non-hierarchical manner. It is about heterogeneity and multiplicity. It is about personal connections that are supple, mobile, sometimes secret, silent, undocumented, unpredictable, and resistant to bureaucratic capture. In other words, it was improvisational. Washington's parable is quite compatible with Murray's concept of the Omni-American, one of several ideas for which Murray became well known. Omni, in Omni-American, is an identity modifier that encompasses other modifiers. It is an umbrella term that includes African American, Irish American, Korean American, and all the Americans. It is a theory about the complexity of cultural dynamics. For Murray, all Americans are culturally part Native American, part African American, part Yankee, and part frontier explorer, hence Omni-American. That combination can then be extended to other groups that have influenced our culture. It is as flexible and universal as Washington's statement. It is an antidote to rigid identitarian ideologies and the sort of ethnic parochialism that limits, curtails, and excludes possibilities. Murray's concept is also, in my opinion, an accurate and realistic depiction of how culture works. I would not go so far to say that Murray's concept derives from Washington's speech. Dr. Washington is not the source, but he is possibly a source of Murray's grand conception. The Omni-American concept resulted from Murray's extension, elaboration, and refinement of the work of the American cultural historian Constance Rourke and the French man of letters Paul Valéry. It owes something to Frederick Douglass as well. In Frederick Douglass's speech, Our Composite Nationality, is required reading. Incidentally, there is an unbroken line of mentorship extending from Douglass to Will Marion Cook to Duke Ellington to Albert Murray. But as Murray understood Washington, the Atlanta Exposition Address was about reminding the Northern industrialists not to forget about African Americans in the South. For Washington, that moment at the Atlanta Exposition was not unlike the break for a jazz musician. It was a moment of truth which demanded Washington's personal best. Against very long odds, Washington was making the case for the economic participation of African Americans in the rapid industrialization of America that was taking place. In Murray's blues metaphor, improvisation lies at the heart of his conception of heroism. It serves as indispensable equipment for the hero's quest to defeat dragons, hooded and otherwise. In 1971, Murray took issue with the leading historian of the South, C. Van Woodward, on this point, about the meaning of the Atlanta Exposition Address, even though he and Woodward were friends and he admired much of Woodward's work. Murray's commentary on this can be found in the New Haven chapter of South to a Very Old Place. Woodward may have missed the point about the meaning of Washington's address, yet his chapter on Washington in his 1951 study, The Origins of the New South, is valuable for other reasons. Through studying Washington's letters, Woodward came to understand him as someone who wielded political power with aplomb. Robert J. Norrell's 2009 biography, Up From History, goes into detail about Washington's political shrewdness and skill and the dangers and complexities of the epoch in which he operated. As Langston Hughes famously said, Washington lived with his head in the lion's mouth. The obstacles he overcame are scarcely fathomable today. Mr. Murray was born 1 year after Booker T. Washington died. They faced different challenges and had different opportunities. But Murray never lost sight of Washington's example. 90 years after Dr. Washington died, Murray published the sentence quoted above from his final novel, Let that bucket down right there where you at, old partner. You know what the man said. He had no doubt that the reference could stand on its own without explanation. But who is the man of you know what the man said? Washington thus becomes a readable trace in Murray's novel, present through a variation on his words. He looms through and in spite of his conspicuous absence in the tetralogy of novels full of fictional renderings of historical personages. Who do the words belong to in the novel? Within the framework of the novel, it's as if they belong to the ages. When the protagonist speaks that paraphrase of Washington's quotation, he is hailing a character named Taft Edison, a character closely modeled on Ralph Ellison. The character's name is derived from a joke from a letter that Ellison wrote to Murray in 1952, included in their published letter collection, Trading Twelves. Murray and Ellison were friends and colleagues and confidants, but they differed on several important points. One of those points was their relationship with Tuskegee. Murray's Tuskegee experience was entirely different from Ellison's, and Murray's portrayal in his fiction of a college based on Tuskegee is utterly different from Ellison's Invisible Man. It is in Murray's second novel, The Spyglass Tree, published in 1991, that he draws on his Tuskegee experience in the most depth. The college in Murray's novel, inspired by Tuskegee and located just off of Route 80, is a space where intellectual discourse and curiosity thrives. The protagonist is more concerned with his personal development than with the management of the school, yet he is willing to risk his future and perhaps his life to help a group of friends he's met in the town, who have inadvertently become the targets of a racist mob. It is in the run-up to the potential conflict with the mob that Murray includes an anecdote about how the college in the novel defended itself from the Ku Klux Klan some 15 years earlier, a story closely based on the true story of how Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute defended itself in 1923. Murray liked to tell the true story of how the ROTC cadets, in whose footsteps Murray would follow, defended the campus and effectively scared off the Klan. Incidentally, I published an article about how the story of the defense of the college functions within the logic of the novel and how it affects the protagonist's motivations. I interweave this study of the novel with a discussion of the historical defense of the campus. It is in the new issue of African American Review, Volume 51, Issue 1. One cannot speak at length about Murray and Tuskegee and not mention this story, which he never tired of telling with pride and admiration. So while a paraphrase of Washington's words appear rendered into novelistic discourse in The Magic Keys, Washington himself does not form the basis of a character in Murray's novels. The campus in Murray's novel has a different sort of origin story and monument. The monument in Murray's novel features, quote, 3 former fugitive slaves known as the Triumvirate, a field hand, a blacksmith, and a handyman who had escaped to the North to join the Union Army 18 months before Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. While Murray considers Washington's legacy in some detail in South to a Very Old Place, he exercises a novelist's license in his fiction, partially for the purpose of counterstating the image Ellison presents in Invisible Man. Murray's admiration for Washington had less to do with his political positions per se than with his personal characteristics, his savvy, his diplomacy, his ability to communicate. Murray was rather similar to Washington in several significant ways. Neither man carried his father's last name. Both performed manual labor in their youth in order to afford transportation to college. Colonel William H. Walcott, Commandant of the Tuskegee Cadet Corps, the ROTC Cadet Corps, and organizer of the defense against the Klan in 1923, remarked in 1915, following Washington's death, that while Washington was as busy as a person could be, he nevertheless, quote, was always accessible to everyone, great or small. This applied to Murray word for word. I wouldn't be here today if it hadn't. Murray would talk to anyone, at least once. He didn't wait for the right student or a particular type of student. He cast down his bucket where he was. And he demanded the same rigor of the famous and of the unknown. The great writer Sidney Offutt once noted that with Murray you knew when you made the cut, but you were always being tested intellectually, which forced you to make every effort to ensure that you remained worthy of the elevated perch on which you had been placed. Being busy was second nature to Murray as it was to Washington. Murray was always writing, reading, researching, and learning. Many commentators speak of Washington's boundless energy. Murray's career attests to a similar tirelessness. They were both driven. They were both institution builders. Murray helped to build and found Jazz Lincoln Center. Building institutions takes a special combination of vision and tenacity. They both knew how to talk to all different types of people. They were both shrewd. They were both highly disciplined. And like Washington, Murray loved jokes, both hearing them and telling them. His sense of humor was rich and eclectic. Did Murray consciously follow Washington's examples, or were they naturally similar in their personal characteristics? We'll never know. Albert Murray arrived at Tuskegee in the fall of 1935 after having graduated from Mobile County Training School. He was born in 1916 in inauspicious circumstances. His biological father, John Young, was from Tuskegee. His biological mother, Sudie Graham, met his father in the town. Young was about 21 and Graham was about 16. Murray was born in Nokomis, Alabama, and adopted almost immediately by Maddie and Hugh Murray, a caring older couple from Mobile. Sudie Graham moved to Mobile to be near her child. When Murray was a senior in high school, his basketball team traveled to a state tournament at Tuskegee. As a 5'7" man, Murray once joked, it was a different era of basketball. It was at this moment that he first met his biological father. John Young had become the foreman of Tuskegee's power plant after serving in World War I. When Murray attended Tuskegee, he lived with Young and Young's family for the first few years and worked with him in the power plant. Some years later, after reading the British anthropologist Lord Raglan, who studied motifs of hero stories from around the world, Murray was able to conceptualize or reconceptualize his relationship with Tuskegee in terms of myth and legend. So many heroes from folklore and myth are described as having had an unusual early life, and as infants are often separated from their parents and the communities of their parents, with their true identities obscured or hidden. Once the hero's identity is revealed and accepted, grand achievements quickly follow, and he brings various forms of good fortune to his community. Tuskegee was like a kingdom from which Murray, as an infant prince, had been exiled, but he would return and go on to heroic endeavors. At least that's how he was able to conceptualize it. Murray was thus able to understand his own relationship to Tuskegee in terms of a well-established narrative pattern. Murray probably attended his first Founders Day address in the spring of 1936. But the first solemn event he attended at Tuskegee Institute was most likely the installation of Frederick Douglass Patterson as Tuskegee's third president on October 28, 1935. Murray often told me of how he listened to Mary McLeod Bethune address the audience on that day. Frederick Douglass Patterson, said Bethune, keep your hand on the plow. This moment stuck with Murray for the rest of his life. Reflecting on the founders' days of his youth, Murray wrote in South to a Very Old Place when he was in his early 50s that it was amazing to consider that in the 1930s, Washington had been gone for 20 years or so, even though it seemed like much longer than that to an undergraduate at the time. Murray relays this idea as follows, quote, such was the oldness of Booker T. Washington in chapel on Founders Day that next spring, what with the choir singing against the background of the stained glass windows, what with the words being spoken as if recited from parchment scrolls, what with his monument outside among the academic cedars, that he seemed to have belonged not to any specific generation, but to all the ages, as did Abraham Lincoln, and Frederick Douglass, and Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. But then such is the miraculous nature of memory and make-believe, and I'm still quoting Murray here, and hence the very essence of human consciousness, that not only do forgetfulness and recollection go hand in hand, they are in truth indispensable to each other. Nor is such recollective forgetfulness in any fundamental sense unrelated to the reciprocal interaction of mythology and actuality in the whole question of your personal identity. For more often than not, when you say slavery time, folks back in slavery time, grandma and grandpa back in the olden days of the old plantation, you are neither thinking nor feeling in terms of the literal time involved. You are almost always thinking once upon a time. After all, isn't the oldness of Uncle Remus, who is of necessity less old than Aunt Hagar, mother of us all, every bit as ancient as the oldness of Aesop? Such, in any case, was the nature of the oldness of Booker T. Washington, whose greatness you celebrated in the chapel in those days, unquote. In those days at Tuskegee, all undergraduates had to learn a trade in addition to their major. Printing was Murray's trade, but he was more interested in what was in the books than how the books were made. His major was education, but he was enamored by the theater. He arrived at Tuskegee knowing something about the Harlem Renaissance, having studied Alain Locke's anthology, The New Negro, at Mobile County Training School. At Tuskegee, he began a systematic study of literature under Morteza Drexel Sprague, who was to become a great friend and colleague. Through his mentorship of Murray and Ellison, Mort Sprague changed the course of American literature. Murray was also influenced by his classmate John Gerald Hamilton, whose erudition inspired him. He describes Hamilton's dorm room as being simultaneously like the Renaissance workshop of Benvenuto Cellini and the London flat of Sherlock Holmes, where one could discuss Chaucer and Boccaccio, or Einstein and Picasso. Murray's Tuskegee sounds like the ideal college campus. Here he struck a balance between prescribed study and personal exploration. He credits the library at Tuskegee with making him cosmopolitan. Murray graduated in 1939 and returned to teach and direct the Little Theater in 1940. From 1944 through 46, he served as a training officer for the Tuskegee Airmen at Tuskegee Army Airfield. He then returned to teach at the Institute. In 1950, he went to study French at the Sorbonne in Paris via the GI Bill. Tuskegee gave him $300 toward expenses, equivalent to 6 weeks' salary at the time. This trip was pivotal for Murray's career. In Paris, he befriended fellow incipient author James Baldwin, but more importantly, began a lifelong friendship with the artist Rosemary Bearden. On June 3rd, 2007, Murray was awarded the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal from the Du Bois Institute at Harvard University. Henry Louis Gates Jr. traveled to New York to bestow the medal at Murray's apartment, as Murray was too frail to travel by this time. He was 91. It was a joyous day, and Murray was in good spirits. The late Dr. Benjamin F. Payton, president of Tuskegee at the time, was on hand, and before the assembled audience and the apartment was packed, he spoke the following wise words. He said, W.E.B. Du Bois didn't have all the answers. Booker T. Washington didn't have all the answers. Al Murray doesn't have all the answers, and neither do any of us. Indeed. But there is wisdom and value in the answers they had. I believe Murray's work holds the key to solving some of the most pressing problems facing our world today. A little later this morning, we will inter the ashes of Major Albert Murray, retired from the United States Air Force, Bachelor of Science in Education from Tuskegee Institute, Master of Arts in English from New York University, Honorary Doctor of Letters from several colleges and universities, author of 13 books, dynamic teacher, devoted husband and father, esteemed and generous mentor and friend, and luckily for us, one of the great sages of human history, one of those sages who has taught mankind an order it has yet to find. And we prepared to inter the ashes of Moselle Menifee Murray, dedicated teacher and mother, gourmet cook, elegant hostess, native of the town of Tuskegee and a Tuskegee Institute alumna, and a paragon of grace and kindness. As we prepared to go forth on this fine spring day and walk across the campus they loved so much, and that it took Booker T. Washington's special genius and vision to build, and then from there disperse to our far-flung homes, let us remember, quoting Murray's words in South to a Very Old Place, that, quote, going back home has probably always had as much, if not more, to do with people as with landmarks and place names and locations on maps and mileage charts anyway. Not that home is not a place, for even in its most abstract implications, it is precisely the very oldest place in the world, unquote. And where was home for Murray? And where is home for Murray? Murray was a Southerner by orientation, a Mobilian by upbringing, a New Yorker and Harlemite by choice for 50 years, a citizen of the world by temperament, education, and travel, and a Tuskegean in spirit, guiding principles, and devotion. God bless Moselle Murray, Albert Murray, Booker T. Washington, and Tuskegee University. Thank you very much.